Okay, so that's us live now, Alistair. So good morning,
Okay.
Alistair.
Good morning, David.
And we're sort of doing a chat this morning about the frontier poets and what they can tell us, and specifically doing this around Ulster Scots Language Week. And we're trying to look at, because I think often when we talk about Ulster Scots language, there's a sort of preponderance of we look to Burns, which is no bad thing, but we're sort of trying to look a bit further afield than that. And one of the places we're looking at this time is looking at the influence into America.
Yes.
The connection between Ulster and America. And so we're talking about two poets who, have been, Robert Dinsmoor and Captain Jack Crawford. Both of them have connections to here in some way, some more direct than others. But basically, in many ways, I suppose they're different time scales that they fell within. But the question to sort of start, I suppose, is off is, could they both be described as frontier poets?
Yes, they could, in that the early frontier wars, New England was Massachusetts, New Hampshire, the state of Maine, because you had a frontier there with the English, with the French, and with the Penobscot Native Americans. And indeed, Dinsmoor's poetry touches on all three in times. I like to look at history through the eyes of poets, David, because I think it was Emily Dickinson who said one time, tell the truth, but tell it at a slant. And that's what these poets do. They give you a slant on the truth. You can study history, you can walk around graveyards, you can look at documents, you can look at old papers, birth certificates, death certificates, and they give you the shape of history, the comings and goings, presumably, battles and all that kind of thing. But if you want a real insight into what were people thinking, what were they experiencing, what were the day-to-day struggles they were having, then these two poets give you that and give you it in a very real way. Okay. And Dinsmoor very much does that because he wrote for his friends and neighbours, and the poems were published in the Haverhill Gazette and the local newspapers. So they very much related to the events of the day.
And it would have been very sort of relevant to the people around him.
Oh yeah, it was a kind of, here's Dinsmoor's thoughts on what happened last week. It was that kind of thing, It was their equivalent of the Peston program or something like that, in a way. And that's how I see it. A very snooty person from a historical society there wrote to me and said, Mr. McReynolds, what are you going to come and talk to us about? And I said, I'm going to talk about Robert Dinsmoor, the poems of Robert Dinsmoor. I said, no. Very snootily said, we don't want a poetry lesson. We're a history society. So I wrote her back a nasty letter, as I can do, and said, well, actually, if you study these poets, you'll learn a lot about history. And it's a good way in for people, and a handy way in for people. Say, oh, what was that about? Just as genealogy is a good way into history. Because people say, oh, what was that about? What was the American Civil War about? And, it broadens out from that. That's the way I see it, anyway.
It was interesting looking, when I was looking through the book as part of the research, when we were talking about doing this, just to find, he's writing poems about things that have happened, very, very recently to people who he knows. And there almost is that, thing of like, this is like, it's almost like an equivalent to here's a newspaper slant on something, which sometimes I think...
That's quite right. And as I say, they're written for newspapers. For the Haverhill Gazette is one that I remember that he was published in quite a lot. And I mean, this is a man born 2 years before Robbie Burns. And once we get into looking at the actual poems here, I'll give you an example of one he wrote about his dog when he was just 15 years of age. And it's very like Burns, although at that stage, Burns must only have been 13, so there was no way he was emulating or imitating Burns, certainly not in the early poems,
Yeah. Okay, so we'll break it down then and look at Robert Dinsmoor, described as the rustic poet of New Hampshire. Tell us a bit about him.
Well, Robert Dinsmoor's great-grandfather, John Dinsmoor, came to County Antrim. Ballywaddick, outside Ballymoney, on the Coleraine side of Ballymoney, is where we pick him up in 1666 on the Hearthmoney roll. And he's supposed to have had a row with his brother, who's the local laird, refused to hold the horse or something while his brother got on, one of these stupid things. But he came to there. There's some suggestion And I'm getting into this now that they may have lived at Kilrea, in Kilrea before they moved to Ballymoney. But anyway, we know Ballywattock outside Ballymoney, 1666. His son, also called John then, he emigrated to New England in 1723. That's about 5 years after the famous Reverend McGregor left from Achadui with the 5 ships and went to New Hampshire and studied what was the best place to live, and ended up at Londonderry, New Hampshire, which they founded. Incidentally, they founded a Londonderry and a dairy, which was quite a smart move when you think of our own situation here in Northern Ireland. So they could please everybody, presumably. No, that wasn't why they did it, but they did. So he landed first in Maine at a place then called Fort George. It's now called Castine, Maine. And he's known as Daddy Dinsmoor because he was like the first of the sort of the American Dinsmoors, if you like. He befriended the local Indian tribe who used to come and talk to him when he was building his first house in Maine. And they used to say to him, all one brother. And notwithstanding that, they kidnapped him and held him for 3 months. But he befriended the chief of the Indians, also called John. And he actually then engineered it for John Dinsmoor to escape. And he ran on foot from Maine and ended up in Londonderry, New Hampshire, where, being a stonemason, he built a house and then sent back to Ballywattock, for his wife and family. Now, John's son William then was born in 1731 in Londonderry, New Hampshire, and it's his son Robert, the poet, the man we're talking about, who was born in 1757. So basically, his father comes in 1723, 1757 he's born. He publishes in 1828 his incidental poems, almost 100 years after his grandfather has left Ballymoney. And yet he's writing in Scots. This is the amazing thing. You think of people talking about Ulster Scots, it's an Ulster thing, and we just speak it here, and they speak a version of it in Lowland Scotland. No, Dinsmoor's writing and presumably speaking like that in New England. So we're getting a look at what the frontier was like in Scots, which makes it very interesting, you know. Yeah. And not just Scots language, but Scots temperament and Scots psychology. We know where they're coming from, these people.
Yeah, because there's much in the poetry, I think, that would sort of, when you do look at the poetry, and we'll get you to read some of the poems later, yeah, you do get that sense of, you know, almost harking back to the old country.
Very much, very much.
He would never have been in the old country, you know, he was entirely of the new country.
Exactly. And yet, you know, when he, that poem I talked about that he wrote when he was 15, I'll just read you a little bit about it. It's called Skip, which was the name of his dog. And he used a wonderful word, which is mules, which is like mold or the earth. You know, John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the clay. You see that in gravestones. Here moulders the remains of so-and-so. But he calls it mules, and it's a word he uses over and over again. But he says in the poem about Skip, though like a lord man o'er ye rules, and bang ye round with chairs and stools, and bruise ye with the old pot bulls, mind not their powers, their bodies man gang to the mules, as well as ours. So he's talking about how creatures are at one with humanity. And that's a very modern concept in a way, this notion of, you know, animals and plant life and so on being all part of a whole. And yet here he is as a 15-year-old boy writing about it. And, you know, Burns writes about things like that, obviously, with the mouse and so on, that he turns over with the plough in the field. So in a very similar way. So there's this Doric similarity, and it's not an affected thing. It's not a contrived thing. Some of the Ulster Weaver poets, you know, they were an imitation of Burns very much. And to an extent in his later life, he becomes a bit like that. Dinsmoor becomes like that. He's aware of Burns, and he writes a poem to Burns about how the both of them would get on well together, and they could both drink a pint together and this type of thing. But in the early stages, it's definitely not imitative, David. You know, it's it's anything but.
You know, if you're saying there, like, that poem's written when he's 15 to his dog.
Yep.
Burns is 13.
Yes, exactly.
How far out is it from, you know, Burns could have been a fantastic poet by the age of 13, but he wouldn't have been published and he wouldn't have been, you know, known across the globe. So if he's right,
there's no way he was imitating him. No. Yeah. And then one of the things one of the things I was going to say I like to do was, there was a book came out and somebody gave it to me 20 years ago and more now, called Albion Seed, as by a Professor Fisher in America, David Fisher, and he looks at different British folkways and looks at how they carried through into America. And the group he looks at, the Scotch-Irish or the Borderers, it's very interesting to take the headings of some of the things that he looked at and then see how that works out in Dinsmoor's poems. Mm-hmm. So he looked, you know, education, religion, child rearing, these kind of things. And we get a glimpse of those through, again, Dinsmoor's poetry.
Yeah, because, you know, if you, when you're looking at his poems, you know, you are seeing very much there, and you touched on one of the things, you know, that appears to have played a big role in his life around education.
Very much so. And very much you get a glimpse of how the whole group of people in Londonderry, New Hampshire, were involved in this. Various members of the community. And Dinsmoor himself says people that were involved and weren't always carefully chosen in teaching the young people. He says in a verse, "Yes, Johnny, I remember well. I taught you little words to spell, and sat as master, strange to tell, in place of better, and learned you how to hold a quill and form a letter." And that business of learned you is very much an Ulster thing. You know, people say it's not learned, it's taught you. Mm-hmm. But there seems to be in the Scots idiom this distinction between teaching and learning.
Yes.
Teaching is what people do at the blackboard. It's like pedagogy. But learning is stuff you learn from experience and what people pass on to you. And, you know, people say, I learned you. You know,
many a time I did something relatively stupid and ended up, you know, making a mess of something, and you would have come in and your mom would have said to you, "That'll learn you."
That'll learn you for the next time. That's right. So it's, you know, so he taps into that in talking about education. I thought was interesting, but he talks on another point about how the local school teacher, forget his name, if he took the notion to hunt squirrels or something on his way to school, he would have just to let the children sit there and, you know, arrived 10 hours later, this kind of thing, you know. So it wasn't as carefully controlled or orchestrated by the community as it might have been. It's tied in very much with religion in that people were being taught very much to read the Bible, the King James Bible, and to understand, be able to sing hymns, because he says at one point that the people taught their offspring to read and hymn their Maker's praise. So that's very much the function of what they see reading as being about, the business of the word. And Presbyterians, of course, very much into the word more than any other branch of religion, preaching and the use of words to communicate faith.
It'd be one of the things that would have been quite prevalent, you know, if you think about, you know, if you go back to the time of the Reformation, one of the big issues was about making the Bible available in the common.
Absolutely, yes.
Man could read it, because in that way, there's that sort of Reformation belief that in that way, then you have access to the means of salvation.
Well, you see, I mean, the development of people reading the Bible and the Reformation is very close to, it follows on closely from the invention of the printing press. And of course, Wycliffe, you know, was burned at the stake for you know, trying to create a people's Bible. But James I, that was one of the things that founded the rhythms of Ulster speech as well. You know, he pushed ahead with what's called the King James Bible. But the Presbyterianism that they espoused wasn't always narrow. Dinsmoor sees it as being like a branch of a tree, and that burning bush image always comes into my head of reaching out both into the community and beyond the shores that they were in. He says they also favoured, and you know, he's just writing this in a letter, They also favoured a broad national church, but one which was ruled by strong synods of ministers and elders, rather than bishops and priests. The theology of Presbyterianism was Calvinist. Its worship centred on preaching and conversion. That was how they viewed the religion. And throughout, it's not just Presbyterianism with Dinsmoor, it's very much like a Trinitarian Presbyterianism, because Unitarianism was coming into America from Ulster, actually, at just about the time he was living and worshipping in New Hampshire. And one of the preachers that's sent in is a Unitarian, and they're very much opposed to him. And it splits the congregation. And one group go one way and they meet in the middle on a Sunday. And he writes about that. And then a very traditional, MacGregor is eventually followed by a very traditional clergyman who came from Bovedy outside Kilrea called the Reverend Matthew Clark. And he's a big character that you can read about in the history books. But he delivers a very, what would you say, enigmatic and forceful form of Presbyterianism to them. And Dinsmoor writes about all that,
And it's interesting too, one of the things that, if you're reading about how America developed, there's a sense almost that, many of the people who had traveled to America from Ulster, that sort of frontiers people in some ways, in those early stages, those are exactly the same people. They're shaped, many of them are shaped by religious belief, amongst other elements. Not everybody departed Ulster for America because of wanting religious freedom, and he did. But a lot of the religious sort of, those who sort of did hold the religious views, a lot of them then play a role in the sort of the path that America travels down that ultimately leads to revolution. I think
absolutely.
Isn't there an English general is supposed to have said something along the lines of, this is nothing other than a Scots-Irish Presbyterian rebellion?
I think it was, Horace Walpole sometimes, credited with saying that. And I think there certainly is a dynamism there, in their religion that makes them want to reach out. Because he says also, far blooming branch ordained to be a graft of that illustrious tree whose boughs shall stretch out to sea. So he sees it very much as like a sea to sea thing.
Mm-hmm.
But you're quite right. And Dinsmoor himself served in the revolution. Most interestingly, again, for Ulster people, he talks about the gun that he carried.
Mm-hmm.
He calls the ISLAND Aquarium. And it's a gun that has seen service at the Siege of Derry and that has been brought with them to America. And, the platoon that he was in, he fought at the Battle of Bennington, but he was just, I think in his teens. But he carried that gun with him. So there was a connection. And in a way, it's a dark connection, isn't it? He actually brought the gun from the Siege of Derry with him and it was used in the Revolution. So
I think in that poem, you're sort of almost getting this sense of, because across the three verses, you're getting the first verse very strong, that sort of harking back to the old country, so it talks about ne'er surrender, you're getting Siege of Derry almost, you're getting then, moves on to the next one, he's talking about, here we have Indian warriors, frontier spirit, and then almost is it that you're at the end of it where he's sort of almost have come through the revolution and now it's just the gun that lies about the house or something,
That's quite right, yes.
It's a part of their sort of life, that this is...
It comes to that whole thing of the right to bear arms, which is very relevant in America right up to the present time. It's kind of born out of that, if we're honest about it. So very much, you're right about education. The whole community is involved in getting kids to school. So he says, through drifts of snow with fingers numb, the Uncle Joe would help you some, but growing colder, that gladly I would take you home upon my shoulder. And you get the sense there of a community, people putting their arms around each other and looking after each other. It's said that Native Americans never actually attacked Londonderry, New Hampshire itself. And why that says there are lots of theories, that there wasn't really a water or a river that close that they could have, you know, used their canoes, their war canoes to come. But the other thing is supposed to be that their reputation was such that the people didn't want to tangle with them, the Native Americans by and large. Because not all Native Americans were warlike. That's quite wrong, you know, to think that way. Yeah. So they didn't tend to mix it with them. And McGregor had been at, the Reverend McGregor had been at college with the French governor in Montreal, and he was friendly with them, and the French didn't actually ever attack them either directly. So an interesting community. The Scotch-Irish, we always talk about them as being like the great individuals, the frontiersmen, striking out with the wagon trains and heading west and so on. And really we say, oh, that's how they lost their culture in a way. They were such individuals. If there's anywhere comes close to a sounding board for the culture of Ulster in early America, it's New England, particularly Londonderry, New Hampshire.
And so he seems to have led a very, very interesting life. You know, he plays a part in society. It's really interesting for me when you're looking back at this, and fair enough, you know, you're going back a long time here, and we're not going to be able to pull photographs off the internet of him, but he just doesn't really appear, you know, you can't find much information about Dinsmoor as a person. His descendants, you know, go on to play quite important roles in various offices of state within America.
That's right. Yeah.
So you obviously get the sense that he was a family man, and, you know, and
very much. I mean, John Greenleaf Whittier talks about him, his simple honesty. He admires this person. Whittier's a major poet. In fact, the new edition that we hope to bring out, Frank Ferguson, myself, of Dinsmoor's poems, I have an afterword which really looks at what Whittier said about him. But he says he was an honest individual, and he pictures him in a market, meeting him in a market, and, you know, his broad leather shoes, and he says, if I'm honest, he was buying New England rum. And
on after my own heart.
He's very much seen as a straightforward, although Presbyterian, straightforward and fairly, you know, in a way quite broad in his outlook. One of the things I thought was interesting was you have Burns's poem, you know, his most famous poem, My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose. Probably if you ask people what's in it. But Dinsmoor looks at that poem, and Professor Fisher had talked about the Scotch-Irish in particular having this thing which he called, big word, nescient fatalism, like a built-in fatalism. You know, that sort of thing where you say to people, that's a nice sunny day. Aye, but it'll be likely raining tomorrow. You know, whatever you would say positive, they would give you the negative right back and he does that in a way with Burns's poem. He says, although he appreciated beauty, there's no doubt about that, but he's not taken in by any kind of soppy or sentimental visions. I'm not saying Burns is that, but he answers Burns by saying, from rural scenes I've long been torn, and mony a scalp frae fortune born. Lamenting that o' life's gay morn, I'm now bereft. I see nae rose, but fin the thorn, alane is left. So, you know, he sees the thorn, where other people see the rose, and it's the old half-glass thing, you know. He sees the half-empty element.
Yeah.
So that's I suppose the main difference between the two. And I wonder, is that something, if you were looking at Ulster people and say Ulster Scots and Scots, is that something that has been fostered or grown here, that kind of fatalism that the Scots maybe don't have to the same extent as we who call ourselves Ulster Scots do, and that carries through them with Dinsmoor?
Yeah, could be.
Could be. I don't know.
Could be. It's one of, you know, I get exactly what you're talking about there. You know, I think there is that element of, you know, anytime you're talking about something, you know, when you say something's going to happen and you'll tell them, well, how quick is this going to happen? You say, oh, you know, realistically, we're probably looking at 5 years, and people look at you and say, sure, we'll be dead by then. You know, you know,
they always see the, you know, but the weather is one in particular I notice, as you say to people, That's a great day. But what about the poor old farmer? There's no rain for him, you know. He needs rain. No matter, you know, they managed to grab success from the mouth of, you know, or grab failure from the success of
success.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and Dinsmoor's poems are a bit like that. I recommend them to anybody. As I say, where else can you get a view in Scots? You know, he writes some in Scots and in English, same as Burns does. Where can you get a view of that anywhere else in terms of New England? And as I say, that was very much a frontier. You saw there with his grandfather, Daddy Dinsmoor, how he was kidnapped, and you know, it was a very real thing.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things, you know, it's a really interesting look at someone who probably has been by and large overlooked. And I think the really interesting aspect of it is the fact that this is someone who 100 years after his grandfather left for America, him never having been in the old country, is still talking and writing his poetry in the way the people around him speak and the way they carried on. You know, so you're not going to write like that if no one understands it.
You talked there, yeah, you're quite right, and you talked there about what others in the family went on to do, and as you know, one of them became governor of New Hampshire, and then some of them, you see some of them in the South, in Alabama and so on. What I think recently is a guy who was a drummer in the early rock band The Doors, you know, that Jim Morrison famously was a singer on. The guy who was a drummer was a guy called John Dinsmoor, Densmore, and he traces his ancestry to these Dinsmoors and to Kilrea, as I was saying. So that may be another tributary of the same thing. Dinsmoor spelled his name incidentally Dinsmoor, but then the more modern version of it, people I met in Maine, in New England, they spell it Dinsmore.
Yeah, I would know a few people in Belfast, and that would be how they spell it.
Yes, the modern day spelling of it is that. And there are some people here who are relatives. I know a man, Robert Dinsmoor, outside Kilrea, whose farm is called Offenmead, which is where, you know, the original Scottish Dinsmoor came from on the River Tweed. And he reckons to be an acolyte of that same family, you know. Okay. So there you are. So that's Dinsmoor, unless there's anything else you...
No, we've touched on Dinsmoor. So you know, there's Dinsmoor, the man who New England at the time when the Dinsmoor family arrived is the frontier. And I think I'm going to share an image here. The next person we're going to talk about Jack Crawford. And I think Jack Crawford, if anybody sort of, you know, has an idea of what
a frontiersman looks like,
frontiersman looks like, you know, certainly as a child growing up, when you would have thought of Davy Crockett and, you know, Bill and all the rest of it, and suddenly, you know, you have an image like this, and there it is, you know, there
he is,
Jack Crawford in 1881, I think this one is.
And if you say to people, who does that look like? They say, oh, Wild Bill Hickok. Well, I always say to them, yes, of course he knew Wild Bill Hickok. He wrote poems about him, so it's not surprising. This was him when he was in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show.
Yeah.
That was Jack. Flamboyant.
Yeah.
Handsome, flamboyant, long hair, you know, very much.
Yeah. You're looking at that and thinking, this is a guy who's like, you know, you'd expect him to be doing tricks with that rifle.
Absolutely. And he did do tricks, well, I'll go into it later, but he got injured in a trick that he was doing with Bill Cody. We'll talk about that maybe a bit later, but yes, very much that's what he one of the things that he was involved in. I think that's what you would say.
Yeah.
So
this is Jack Crawford. Tell us a bit about Jack Crawford, because Jack Crawford, he actually hails from these shores and went to America rather than just being a descendant.
That's the important difference, I suppose. Jack was born March 1847, height of the Irish potato famine, in Carndonagh in East Donegal. His father is John Austin Crawford, who was born in Edinburgh in 1816 and apprenticed at a young age to be a tailor near Glasgow. It's said that he was a contrarian, that he was an awkward kind of an individual and was more or less pushed out and came to Donegal, and the family settled there. And Jack, the father, married Susan Wallace, who was a fellow Scot. And certainly, if you go to Carndonagh, there's a lot of Wallaces in the Presbyterian graveyard there. But she claimed that she was a descendant of Braveheart, of William Wallace. And Jack actually worked a little bit of that into his showmanship. Whether it's right or not, I have never gone down the road of tracing that, but it may be right. So the parents, they actually went to America before the kids did.
Right.
And I have to say right away, you know, the father had a considerable drink problem, you would say. But 1861, Jack, just aged 14, 1861, he leaves with the other kids and goes to America to follow them, and sailed from Londonderry here in Ulster, and went to Minersville, Pennsylvania. And Jack got a job then picking slate in a mine. The other way, sometimes you get coal there that's very slatey, you know, according to where the seam is. His job was to go through it, dirty job, and pick through the, you know, throw all the slate away for like $1.75 a week or something like that. But the Civil War was raging. His father had already joined the Union Army, the 48th Pennsylvania Volunteers, and Jack forged his age at the age of 15 and joined the Pennsylvania Regulars. His father was wounded. Jack was wounded twice. Age 17, Jack was wounded. Big battle in the American Civil War, Spotsylvania. And he's taken to a hospital, and the Sisters of Mercy outside Philadelphia, the nuns not only nurse him, they teach him how to read and write, which is a key thing in his life, because as a poet and as a journalist, that's how a key part of how he made it, not the only way, but part of how he made his living. His father died around that time of wounds received in the Civil War and of chronic alcoholism. And Susan dies shortly afterwards, but before she dies, she makes Jack swear on her deathbed that he won't drink, and he doesn't. He adheres to that throughout his life, and that makes a major difference in his life. So Jack, in 1869, marries a local school teacher, Annie Marie Stokes, and they have 5 children, including one of his daughters, May Cody Crawford. And the Cody there, of course, is for William Cody, famous Buffalo Bill, who was his close friend. And I first got to know, well, he writes about the Civil War a little bit, and let me just find the reference here. He's never narrow about the Civil War.
When's he writing this, Alistair? So how far out from the Civil War is he writing about the Civil War?
He's writing it during the Civil War.
Right, okay.
As well as it.
It's like contemporaneous.
So presumably after he learned to read and write, so he must have been maybe late teens, early 20s. And he talks about, well, maybe this bit is written after the war, right enough when I read it. You know that incident in the First World War where the Germans and the British soldiers come up out of the trenches on Christmas Day and play football and share things and so on. Jack writes about a similar incident in the American Civil War with the Confederate troops. And he says, "And often when we shouted, boys, across to Johnny Reb, to throw us some tobacco, boys, and we would throw them bread. How quickly they responded, and the plugs came thick and fast, and we shared them with each of the other boys and shared them to the last." Now, you know, when I look at that, I immediately see not only this sense of brother fighting brother, but if you look at the things that they did share, Confederacy, the guys in the South, the crops that they grow and so on, they share tobacco plugs. But the northern guys, the Union guys, are throwing bread, you know, for the wheat fields and so on, which is their major staple, if you like. So right away, you're getting an insight there with Jack. And that poem was called A Mountain Boy's Letter to General Grant, was how he addressed it. And that's how he very much saw himself. I first came upon Jack Crawford. I won't say I discovered him, but when we put the blue plaque up in Carndonna, Chris Spur was involved in the BBC. I had introduced Chris to him. And how I came upon him was this. You know how you can get these books now that are facsimiles of old books?
Yeah.
I'd come upon a book that was written by a kinsman of mine called Robert McReynolds. And the book was called 30 Years on the Frontier. I think it was published in like 1906 or something. But in it, he describes Crawford. And this was the first description of him that I'd ever read. And I thought, actually, McReynolds, I don't know all that much about you, but that's a well-written piece. He wrote, Captain Jack Crawford, the poet scout, is one of those noble characters whose memory will live so long as records exist of the pioneers who braved the vicissitudes of the frontier and made possible our Western civilization of today. A man of broad mind, daring and brave, and yet with all the sweet tenderness of a child of nature, he became great by achievements alone. Others have gained a temporary fame by dime novels. Captain Jack, in comparison with others, stands out as a diamond of the first water. He has helped to make more trails than any scout, unless it was Kit Carson. That was before the war. During that struggle, he was wounded 3 times in the service of his country. When the war closed, he was for many years Chief of Scouts under General Custer. He led out Leadville in the Black Hills in 1876 and was of great service to the government in the settlement of the Indian troubles, which succeeded the Custer Massacre. That gives you the kind of circles that, Jack was moving in. And he joined us.
The poet scout.
Well, that's right. If you look at the two names, Robert was called the rustic poet of New Hampshire. So he's writing about everyday rustic life, and that frontier was a very rustic one. But Jack's is a different one. He's a scout. He's looking at the Black Hills of Dakota. He's also a gold prospector as well. He's very much that type of really going beyond, I suppose, what Dinsmoor was doing within the confines of what was then America. Because these places weren't discovered. It wasn't until people set out and discovered the West and the wagon trains headed. They were unknown at the time Dinsmoor was writing. He wouldn't have known where the Black Hills were or anything else.
Yeah, so there's a different sort of thing of here's Dinsmoor in some ways is, yes, there's a frontier spirit because he has arrived in the place that is the frontier, but
very much so.
Crawford is actually broadening the frontier by striving.
Absolutely. And that photograph that you showed, exactly encapsulates that spirit of him. One of the people he writes about is Custer, for instance, General Custer, who's nowadays, there's a great tendency to knock Custer nowadays and say, he's bottom of his class at the military academy, and he was a fool to rush in and be massacred in the way they were in the Little Bighorn. But Jack, who actually served with him, says, and he says it in verse, I served with him in the army in the darkest days of the war, and I reckon you know his record, for he was our guiding star. And the boys who gathered round him to charge in the early morn were just like the brave who perished with him on the Little Horn. And the same with Wild Bill Hickok. He knew him as well, and talked about him. And it's actually, his image of Wild Bill Hickok shows Hickok more as a person. There's a softer image to it with how Jack writes about him. He says of Wild Bill, the poem's called The Burial of Wild Bill. And he says, you buried him neath the old pine tree in that little world of ours, his trusty rifle by his side, his grave all strewn with flowers, his manly form in sweet repose, that lovely silken hair. I tell you, pard, it was a sight, that face so white and fair. And it's not the harsh, brittle image that you might expect there. in a poem about Wild Bill Hickok, you know. That's how I see it anyway. There's
They touched on too about Indian troubles and sort of, you know, the after the Little Bighorn, you have the previous the piece you'd mentioned from your kinsman McReynolds, talked about how he then was involved in sort of working at the reservations.
Well, very much so. Jack eventually got a job which put him in charge of the whole business of liquor and the sale of liquor to the Indian reservations. You know, what was sometimes called firewater was actually kind of an opium of the people. It was used as a weapon to, you know, make the Indians lose their senses. It was something they weren't used to, and it was used against them. But Jack tried to prevent that very much with his antithesis, his hatred of liquor. That incident I talked about with Wild Bill Cody, in the incident, whatever way, these things were carefully choreographed, as you know, and Jack managed to get shot in the groin with a pistol, and he blamed it on Cody being drunk and mistiming the whole trick, and the two of them kind of were distanced for a long time after that, you know, that he had this great...
Shot in the groin by a drunk man probably changes your opinion.
Doesn't enamor you to them, you know. I think that's... The other soft side I found in Jack's poetry was he touches on loneliness at times. This business of being, you know, on the frontier and outward bound. And Jack's all over the country. So you find him up in British Columbia, no less, prospecting for gold and sub-zero temperatures. And he wrote these lines when he was sitting in a cabin, you know, where he'd been prospecting for gold. You may hear my dogs in the background there. Usually when postman or something's coming, you'll hear them. But maybe you won't because I have headphones. So anyway, this is what Jack wrote about prospecting in British Columbia. He said, "Lonely in my cabin musing, how the time does pass away. Not a soul to wish me gladness, not a friend to pull my ears, while my heart is filled with sadness, thinking of the passing years." And Jack wasn't racist in terms of the Native Americans. He wasn't this, you know, this thing you see in the old Western movies, the only good engine's a dead engine. The lady who's written a major biography of Jack is a lady called Darlis Miller, and she wrote that Jack soon learned that the white man's perfidy could be as deadly to his plans as an Apache ambush. And that was how he viewed it, in terms of somebody who's actually on the frontier dealing with these things. Yeah, he had become a special agent to the Justice Department, investigating the liquor trade and, you know, all the corruption that went with that. I think that's the best term.
Yeah. So, in terms of, did he then came back to his...
He did very much. I mean, he was 30 years, an actor, a lecturer, a journalist, poet, all these things. And he, in 1894, he got on the steamship Teutonic, and he came and visited his boyhood home in Cardona, where I say there's a blue plaque to him. And during his time there, he did an entertainment in the Guildhall in Derry.
Right.
And the review of it was written for the Londonderry Sentinel by no less a person than William Alexander, who, as you probably know, was the Bishop of Derry and Raphoe, later became Archbishop of Armagh, and was the husband of Francis Cecil Alexander, who wrote Once in Royal David City and All Things Bright and Beautiful and all those wonderful hymns. So he was a discerning person to be doing the reviews, and he thoroughly enjoyed Jack's entertainment there, and said that he very much reminded him of Bret Hart, who was, you know, a similar kind of wit at that time. Jack also wrote a poem about it, as you would imagine, and the poem's called In Donegal. Would you like me to read it?
Yes.
It's called In Donegal. Oh, would that I again a boy could be, roaming barefooted by the Irish Sea. My world so small, watching the flocks that graze beyond the shore, wrapped in the cast-off coat my father wore in Donegal. I see myself bareheaded in the breeze, wading the shoals, salt water to my knees. The seagulls call and wake of passing ships that greeted me, en route to God's sweet land of liberty from Donegal. Then comes a loved vision on the strand, a blue-eyed Irish lass who took my hand in hers so small and said to me in accents sweet and low, "You'll ne'er forget the girl that loved you so in Donegal." Oh, sweet and holy love of 10 years old, Mary of Donegal with hair of gold, with rippling fall. Goodbye, God bless you, little playmate Jack. You won't forget. Someday you will come back to Donegal. Years passed. Again I found me on the strand, and I was just a boy once more, unmanned, bare feet and all. I sighted for Mary as in days of yore, but whispering waves made answer, nevermore in Donegal. It's a very nice little poem.
Yeah.
Quite sentimental, but very nice for all that, I think, and very gives an insight into someone who was a tough guy, but was a tough guy with a soft heart, I think you would say.
Yeah.
And a sensitive person.
And I think maybe in some ways it shows, that the two aspects of the name, the poet and the scout, were both there.
In all of this, Jack never was what you would call a good family man.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Dinsmoor was more so, and his wife was left for long periods on her own with the kids. He virtually sort of died eventually on his own in Long Island of Bright's disease.
Mm-hmm.
At a place called Woolhaven. He died in 1917.
Yeah.
As late as that, just in the end of the 20th century. What an interesting character! There's no doubt about that. And again, one until I read that by Robert McReynolds, I'd never heard of. And one of the things, David, people say to me a lot of times is, why did we never learn this in school?
Mm-hmm.
And somebody who's involved in education, I feel kind of guilty with that, about that, because we definitely didn't learn any of this history at school. No. Why not? People thought it was a hot potato. I mean, how is it a hot potato if you look at poetry and what poets are saying? Or you go back to Emily Dickinson, you look at the world with a slant, then you sometimes see it better, And definitely, I know you guys are doing wonderful work in reaching out with the schools, and there's wonderful work being done now. And it's about time, really.
I think that sort of gives us a fascinating insight, I think, into two people who probably, I think it's safe to say, are lesser known by the wider sort of public.
Well, I hope the public will read these people themselves now, yeah.
I think there's a need there for us to sort of do a bit of work round about promoting people like this and promoting greater awareness of them.
Yeah.
And that's maybe something that we need to take forward organizationally and about looking.
Well, Jack's poems are available. You can get copies. These facsimiles that you can get now, where they sort of more or less take a photocopy of the entire book.
Yeah.
I have a couple of Jacks like that. One of them called Campfire Sparks, for instance. So they are readily available. But Amazon is good for all of that. Although bookshops hate Amazon, I find if you're going to look for something niche like that, then you have a better chance of finding it on there. And although the Ulster Historical Foundation did a great job in the Dinsmoor book that Frank and I edited, and it sold out. The first edition sold out, so
hopefully the second edition will be out soon.
The second edition, I think they're talking about making it an ebook initially, but they've been talking quite a while about it. I don't know, I hopefully it'll be out there soon,
Okay. Well, listen,
because I think there's a market for it, as you say.
Yeah, I think we'll finish up there. We'll reprise again soon and go on to the next level, looking at the musical influences of the Ulster and
Scotch-Irish. Yeah,
and there's a story there, I think, too, because it was somebody we touched on in today's conversation that we'll reprise in the musical one tomorrow.